Back in November of 2022, the conservative media outlet The Daily Wire, as part of its newly formed entertainment initiative, announced that they had purchased the rights to adapt Stephen Lawhead's series of novels, The Pendragon Cycle, a fantasy series that mixes together the Arthurian legend with British history in the 4th century. The project would receive significant backing from the company, with a production budget reaching a total of 8 figures, with each of the episodes having a 7-figure budget. The co-CEO of The Daily Wire at the time, Jeremy Boring, took a leave of absence from the company so he could help direct and produce the series as it filmed in Italy and Hungary. After wrapping filming in 2023, an eventual 2024 release was planned on The Daily Wire Plus, but the series never debuted. As the series remained suspiciously absent into 2025, The Daily Wire was entering a fraught time for the company. Major hosts Candace Owens and Brett Cooper departed. Entertainment projects were not quite the mainstream hits they had hoped for, and the Bent Key streaming service, a particularly costly venture for the company, seemed to be a dud, with much of its staff for its original programming being laid off. Boring stepped down as the co-CEO to supposedly focus on unnamed creative projects, leaving the status of the Pendragon Cycle a mystery. But in late 2025, it was announced that the Pendragon Cycle would finally premiere on the Daily Wire Plus in January 2026, finally letting us take a look at this 7-episode series. This series has long been a passion project of Jeremy Boring. Speaking to Mediaite, he said, "I was 21 years old the first time I started writing a screenplay adaptation of the Pendragon Cycle. I didn't have an option. I didn't even know what an option was, but I loved the work and believed I could somehow will a film adaptation into existence." The Hollywood Reporter quoted Boring in a statement on the series ahead of its release. The Pendragon Cycle is the culmination of a 10-year vision to create culture, not just to criticize it. Lawhead's novels present a visceral, masculine Christianity in a world of conflict and mystery. It isn't saccharine or clean. In short, it is very much like our world. To follow the Pendragon Cycle Rise of the Merlin, it helps to know how it relates to the series of novels it's based on. The 7-episode series covers the first 2 published books in the series. The first 2 episodes cover the first book, Taliesin, and the next 5 cover the second book, Merlin. If 2 books spread across 7 episodes sounds like too much plot, you would be right. The series moves very quickly, particularly in its first 2 episodes, introducing characters, places, and plot lines that never seem to get enough time to really be explored. The first 2 episodes follow Taliesin, the father of Merlin, through his entire life, from his infancy to his death as a young man. The story begins in 4th century Britain as the Roman occupation is receding and a power vacuum is created, as a patchwork of feuding kingdoms all vie for power. In the opening scene, a baby floating in a river is discovered by a group of Cymry people. Right from the beginning, you can tell this is perhaps not the most carefully constructed TV series. There's a lot of footage of this floating bundle flowing down the river, but I'm not sure why they decided to use the one shot where we can see the bundle flip over in a way that would have seriously hurt or killed the baby. Turns out the baby is actually fine even after that little flip. As I'm sure most people have noticed, this baby floating down the river is a clear reference to the story of Moses, establishing the religious character of the series right from the get-go. More specifically, we'll be seeing a lot of Christianity as the series goes along. While this aspect of the series has gotten some criticism online, it actually harkens back to an older tradition of the Arthurian stories that mix together Christianity with the Celtic mythology of the British Isles. Over the centuries, that became less fashionable, and more recent stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table have leaned away from those Christian elements. But Stephen Lawhead's books attempt to bring that Christian part of the story back, while adding a few new elements of his own. In this version of the story, Merlin's parents are Taliesin, the baby found in the river, and Charis, a princess of Atlantis. And yes, Atlantis exists in this story. According to Jeremy Boring, Atlantis is inspired by Minoan culture.
Acrobatic leaps over living bulls, something that he borrowed from Minoan culture, where some of his inspiration came from for the Atlanteans.
The Minoan civilization is from the island of Crete, which is part of Greece, so Atlanteans are supposed to be Mediterranean-coded, hence their tradition of bull leaping, which was practiced by the Minoans, and people dressed for much warmer weather than you would find in the United Kingdom. It's also very noticeable that these people are blindingly white. The clean robes and architectural skills are meant to show us how advanced the Atlanteans are compared to the Britons we would meet on the show. No one will be surprised to find out that Atlantis is eventually destroyed, presumably because they were worshipping the false god Bel. Atlantean society is built on the foundation of a falsehood, so their ability to create special swords, castles, and live a very long time ultimately come with the price of their home being destroyed and then becoming refugees, forced to establish a new home in Britain. I'll be using the term Britain when describing the land because that's what the show often does. Although the Irish, for instance, are mentioned in the series, and the Cymry have a fairly sizable role in the first 2 episodes, the series primarily speaks of Britons and their homeland. I don't know enough about the history of this region to really tease out these details, but I'm just following the show's lead on what it names everything. Although we meet Taliesin as a baby and Karis as what appears to be a young woman, these stories are happening at roughly the same time. Atlanteans age very slowly. The series spans a century, but Karis, played by Rose Reed, looks the same throughout its entire run. The series doesn't do the best job of explaining this because when you look at Karis' sister Morgan, we see her as a little girl when Atlantis is destroyed, but 20 years later she's an adult, played by Emery Franklin, while Karis hasn't seemed to age at all. The name Morgan should sound familiar because she is probably more recognizable as Morgan Le Fay from the Arthurian legend. Several characters from that mythology are presented as coming from Atlantis in this series. The Atlantean king Avallac'h, played by Daniel Fathers, would become the Fisher King because he likes fishing, and Karis would become the Lady of the Lake because she likes to go for a swim sometimes.
Lady of the Lake.
The Atlanteans are a strange insertion to the story as their advanced society seems to explain a lot of the mystical elements from the Arthurian legends, such as Merlin not seeming to age and the power of the sword that would be thrust into the stone at the end of the series. By comparison, the Druids seem incredibly shabby, with only Taliesin and later Merlin showing any kind of significant power, and the source of their power seems to become being primarily from the Christian god. In the case of Taliesin, even though he's raised as a druid, the mystery of his birth and his later conversion reveal a more ordained destiny, one that seems to come from a Christian god more so than any druidic tradition. After a 20-year time skip, we see Taliesin, played by James Arden, as an adult who is part of the Cymry people, complete with some truly tragic-looking mustaches. The Cymry are trying to arrange a marriage between him and Karis to unite their people with the Atlanteans. And as the story finally gets going, we're introduced to a lot of characters, places, and events that never get adequately presented. Taliesin and Karis are simple enough, and their respective fathers and Morgan are easy to understand. But as a quick rundown of the other characters that seem relatively important in this 2-episode stretch, we have these 2 Christian monks looking completely out of place for the 4th century, an old druid guy who's teaching Taliesin, this Cymry guy who just seems to be there to be an asshole contrarian, this other old guy who's an advisor to the Atlantean king, this creepy king who Taliesin has to impress with a song, his druid advisor. Also, at one point Karis finds a hawk she later adopts, who then vanishes from the story. All these characters have names and seem important, but the only characters who will be with us for the rest of the season are Karis, Morgan, and their father. The rest, aside from Taliesin, will either slide way into the periphery or be forgotten entirely, as entirely new sets of characters are introduced and in some cases forgotten just as quickly. There are over 50 named characters in this show on its IMDb page. The reason their names don't stick in my mind is because I honestly barely remember any of them. There are simply way too many characters in this story, and it's very hard to care about any of them as we watch this show run through the events of a century of plot. Most of their names and faces can barely make an impression before they're replaced by yet another character in yet another location. As an example of the breakneck pace of this show, in the 2nd episode of the series, it seems to be speeding through the events of Taliesin's life. The episode opens hot off the heels of the 1st episode, with Taliesin having recently converted to Christianity after his face was burned by a vision. In the 2nd episode, we find out that Taliesin is a prophet now.
Henceforth I shall be known as Prophet. Taliesin I am, and my name shall remain until doomsday.
As the Atlantean and Cymry deal falls through, any marriage agreement is nullified, Taliesin and Karis instead fall in love, and he proposes to her.
Marry me, Karis.
What?
Instead of having sex, Taliesin reveals that, as a good Christian boy, he's waiting to get married first.
I would wait till we're married. In the way of the Christians.
I'm betting he wishes that conversion had hit him a few weeks later. Karis, putting aside her distrust of the gods after Atlantis was destroyed by Bel, decides to convert to Christianity. And minutes later, we see the wedding. We then skip forward in time with Taliesin and Karis traveling on their own. Taliesin uses his abilities as a bard to get a king to give up his crown. We then get another time skip to reveal that Caris is pregnant, and things get a little preachy as Taliesin describes the kingdom of summer he hopes to one day make.
It's the kingdom of summer. A kingdom that will shine like the sun so that all men may know and see what the good God intended for it to be.
After that description, Caris immediately goes into labor and Merlin is born. Shortly afterwards, Taliesin is shot in the back by a jealous Morgan. This is all in a single episode that runs for an hour and 6 minutes. And there's also a little teaser at the very end that flashes forward 75 years to introduce Merlin as an adult. This episode's pace is absolutely manic and filled with little plot points that never get the time or space to really flesh themselves out. To drill down a little more into that, I want to give you an example of one specific scene. This takes place when Taliesin and Caris have gotten married and are traveling around together. They show up in a place called Meridunum. At this point in the show, I didn't know why this location mattered, aside from Merlin moving there with his wife for a little bit in a future episode, but I'm not sure why that needed to be set up. But this series has a tendency to announce the arrival at a location without providing enough context. Taliesin and Caris appear before King Pendragon, asking for a place in his kingdom. Pendragon is more than a little creepy.
You will be flogged and driven out. But your lady will stay.
It's clear the king doesn't respect Taliesin or his wife, so Taliesin takes away the voice of the king's advisor and then sings a song that goes on for several minutes.
The cold air claims the leaves, the leaves.
That song was apparently very convincing because the king then decides to give up his throne.
You are the master of all men within the sound of your voice. I stand ashamed and humble before you.
This scene is not particularly well performed. The writing is bland, and I'm often left wondering why we needed so much time on the scene when it could have been put towards many of the other plot points in this episode that similarly don't get enough time to be fully explored. And that's the biggest problem with these first 2 episodes. They're trying to capture a multitude of plot points from a single book, and it starts to feel more like a checklist of events rather than a cohesive story. These first 2 episodes were written and directed by Jeremy Boring, with an assist from Rose Reed for the script in the second episode. And it really reflects the sort of production we might expect from the writer and director of Lady Ballers. In spite of the production values, the whole effort feels very amateurish, and the series might have been better off choosing to focus on one of the books rather than trying to cram 2 into 7 episodes. It also might have been better off with a more experienced writer and director to handle such a big story with so many different characters. The next 5 episodes, covering the second book, do a better job with pacing, although with the disadvantage of having to introduce a whole new set of characters, places, and plot lines. The series fleshes out its real main character, Merlin, played by Tom Sharp, through many flashbacks, learning magic and sword fighting, hanging out with the hill folk, and a brief period of domestic life before his wife is murdered. This is just an aside. Merlin's cheek swirl that he gets from the hill folk really reminds me of Choji from Naruto. I don't think that was intentional, but it's something I couldn't stop noticing. Choji was a lot more fun as a character, though. As a man of power with a strange grasp of the unknown, Merlin is an odd choice for a main character. He's a bit too sullen for my tastes, often brooding and enigmatic, and never really stepping outside of those traits for very long. It takes several episodes to understand why he is the way he is, and even then, it's not a very convincing story, so it's hard to feel the amount of sympathy the story wants me to have for him. Part of the disconnect is this weird mythos that is constantly hanging in the air around him.
The Merlin died long before you and I were born, do not. If he ever lived.
Merlin was born 75 years ago, and the time they're talking about, when Merlin was running around using his powers, was roughly 50 years ago. That seems to be in their lifetime, unless they happen to be aging terribly. So I think this is really just how Merlin's legend has become exaggerated over time. This vague legend is contrasted with the many flashbacks of the series, and the fact that it doesn't quite map on paints a version of Merlin who is both not the powerful terror that people thought he was, but also definitely someone who possesses a lot of power that would seem scary to someone who doesn't realize that he's actually a very nice boy. Another thing we see in these flashbacks is that Merlin is kind of boring. He speaks in vague mysteries and riddles, and again, he's so sullen and such a drab guy that if it weren't for the magical powers and the battles all swirling around him, there's really nothing of interest. In most stories, the use of flashbacks help reveal character traits and histories that inform the present. But in Merlin's case, it reveals the mystery of his character is that he is both powerful and boring. Things we already see plenty of examples of in the main storyline. Speaking of the main storyline, it begins with Merlin leaving his decades in the wilderness to work at the service of the Pendragon brothers, Aurelius and Uther, played respectively by Finney Cassidy and Miles Clohessy. Merlin is helping them assemble an army that will unify Britain against the impending Saxon invasion. Aurelius, thanks to his Roman lineage, believes he has a claim to be the High King of Britain, and Merlin has decided to help him out. This venture involves meeting various kings and other new characters in each episode as Merlin or others try to win them over to Aurelius's cause. The messy structure and bloated cast make the plot challenging, but not impossible to follow. Still, it makes for a frustrating experience as I found myself never quite being on firm enough footing to engage with the story. In the third episode, we see Merlin try to work with Vortigern, played by Colin Cunningham, a king whom Merlin has foreseen losing an upcoming battle. Vortigern is presenting himself as the High King of Britain, but he doesn't quite have the grasp on the land that he thinks he does. We spend a good 20 minutes on this plotline until Vortigern is killed during the battle, and then Merlin changes sides to join Aurelius's cause. While Vortigern's death may have mattered, I don't know why nearly half the episode is spent on a minor character and the other minor characters in his orbit who all either die or are never heard from again. Vortigern has a functional role in the plot as a person claiming to be the High King of Britain, and his decrepit appearance and arrogance symbolize the rot of his rule. But his time on the show is in this strange middle ground that's not long enough to make me care about him, but also not short enough to be a passing mention setting up Aurelius's claim to be High King and how it will be different. In the hands of a more skilled creative team, they might have been able to make more of Vortigern's time on camera, but instead we get this ridiculous action sequence where this old king is somehow able to take out a bunch of guys even though he looks like he'll be dead in a couple of weeks anyway. I saw a tweet from Jeremy Boring describing the women in this series saying, "One thing we were quite particular about was never letting a female character physically overpower a male character. We endeavored to write complex women with feminine strength." It's a weird thing to put out there because surely in a story with magic and sorcery, a woman who's physically stronger than a man isn't that much of a stretch, especially since the rules of physical ability are so obviously broken for Vortigern, who kills half a dozen men, including smashing a fully grown man against a stone wall, even though Vortigern looks like a fragile old man. There is an element of this show that is genuinely interesting, and this is something it takes directly from the title of the books. How the desire to create a more just world is a multi-generational project. That's why the title is the Pendragon Cycle, because it's trying to show the cycles of the Pendragon family working towards that end, starting with Aurelius and Uther, leading to Arthur, and in one of the later books in the series, a reincarnation of Arthur centuries later. This is symbolized in the show by Karis trying to pass down a special weapon called the Sword of Britain.
Whatever the future may hold, I cannot take up that sword again.
Karis repeatedly tries to pass the sword on to a rightful ruler, but none of them can take it up. Her father turns it down, Taliesin turns it down, and Merlin turns it down as well. It's a metaphor for a kingdom that's not ready to be ruled just yet since more work needs to be done to build it. This doesn't explain why Karis can't take up the sword as a ruler herself, but as advanced as the Atlanteans are, they hadn't quite caught up to the idea of a woman being a ruler. I'm not sure what purpose Karis has after she gives birth to Merlin in this show. I know eventually she would become the Lady of the Lake, but that doesn't happen in these 7 episodes. From episode 3 and onwards, she has a few brief moments, but none of them are very essential to the overall plot, and it often feels as though the show is just trying to keep her busy while waiting for her trip to the lake. Speaking of weak female characters, though, I have to spend some time talking about Brett Cooper as Gagnetta. As the most recognizable face on the show, at least to the Daily Wire's audience, there are a lot of high expectations placed on her role. The real challenge, though, was that there wasn't much for her character to do. Just like the show does, I've already spoiled that Gagnetta dies, but to really understand what type of character she is, I have to describe the idea of women in refrigerators. Coined by the writer Gail Simone in 1999, it refers to female characters who are killed off or harmed or in some other way discarded to serve a male protagonist's journey. The colorful descriptor comes from a Green Lantern comic in the 90s where Kyle Rayner, the Green Lantern at the time, found the body of his murdered girlfriend stuffed in a fridge, effectively ending her story in service to the Green Lanterns. that female characters are more likely to fill this role is part of a longer tradition of marginalizing the role of women in fiction, and instead emphasizing male characters, who are far more likely to be the leads. Ganyetta is one of the clearest examples of this type of character. I'm going to break down the 6th episode, which is the only one where we spend any real time with her as a character, as her other appearances are incredibly brief, usually lasting a few seconds. Ganyetta shows up roughly 10 minutes into the episode, randomly running into Merlin in the woods. After chatting and tying up a boar that Ganyetta was hunting, they're already into one another.
After a hunt, I'm accustomed to a swim. You could do with a bath as well.
Merlin finds out she's the princess of a local king, and 10 minutes later, they're in love. We jump forward a year, and when a group of bad dudes attack the village they live in, Merlin rides to her rescue and has a scene where he blacks out and apparently kills a bunch of goons.
Merlin!
After Merlin and Ganyetta hook up one more time, she's again attacked by some goons, only this time Merlin can't protect her because he's meeting with one of his hillfolk friends who's dying. So Ganyetta, who is currently pregnant, dies. We then get a very long scene where we see Merlin grieving over her body, and then he goes on to brutally murder everyone responsible. Ganyetta's close call earlier in the episode, leading to Merlin cutting loose the first time, and this orgy of violence in the finale revealed that this episode is less about this great love of Merlin and more about Merlin's relationship to his own power. Throughout the series, there is this constant pressure that Merlin should use his immense magic to turn the tide of the upcoming Saxon invasion, but he's always reluctant to use it, instead using small gestures and other limited expressions of his abilities. We don't get a very good explanation as to why until this episode, where we see him wipe out a large group of men, not just in self-defense, but killing them after they've been defeated and are running away. It's pretty brutal stuff, and there's an interesting story to be told here about this great power that Merlin has been given by God and what it means to wield it, how he might fear losing himself to violence entirely. The show doesn't quite explore it in a way that's satisfying, with Merlin eventually realizing that the key to using his power is to submit to God's will. A deeper, more personal understanding, I think, would have been more interesting, especially since God's will is often too vague and mysterious in this show, but at the very least, we can say this is an interesting wrinkle in his character. But what about Ganyetta? The episode is named after her, and she's in a large portion of it, but aside from being the thing that motivates Merlin to use his power, she doesn't really have much of a role beyond that. As a character, there's very little personality in her. She's not a typical princess in that she likes to hunt and enjoys teasing Merlin a little, but I'm not sure what else I can say about her that's truly unique. Ganyetta and Merlin fall for each other so quickly, and there are multiple scenes where we see them hook up, which implies that this is primarily a physical relationship. Perhaps because there simply isn't enough time in this episode for them to be more than that, which is, again, the recurring problem with all these episodes. They often feel like they're cramming too much of a story into a short time span, and each plot point's very limited runtime isn't used efficiently enough to get across anything special or unique about these relationships. And this one is particularly egregious because it feels like the series was leading up to this as a major relationship in Merlin's life. Throughout the series, he's haunted by these brief appearances of Ganyetta, and this loss is the reason Merlin ended up living in the woods for decades. In fact, in the previous episode, before this long flashback to his time with Ganyetta, we see Merlin meet Ganyetta's father for the first time in 50 years, and there's a lot of bad blood between them because Ganyetta's father blames Merlin for his daughter's death. As part of his revenge, Ganyetta's father is trying to kill one of Merlin's buddies.
All you've got to do is slay me and save him. Like you could have saved her.
All of this is in part done to build up why this relationship was so important, and the reason it mattered is because she died, not because of who she was when she was alive. I expected a truly exceptional woman when Ganyetta finally appeared, and instead we got someone whose impact can only be felt not through her words or actions, but Merlin's reaction to having lost her. There is another character's death that also drives Merlin. Taliesin, his father, who got 2 whole episodes exploring his character, who he is, and the world he was trying to make. Although I don't think the show did a very good job of presenting his story, I understand in the context of this world why Taliesin was an exceptional man, and Merlin learning the dream of his father is a motivating factor that makes complete sense. Ganyetta gets none of this kind of character development, and she's far more forgettable, and as a result, doesn't have nearly the same amount of impact. That Merlin would kill a bunch of goons for Ganyetta doesn't matter as much as the things that make him feel that way towards her, and it's simply not explored well enough to establish the connection between them. Comparatively, in the last episode, we see a flashback where Taliesin's spirit speaks to Merlin and encourages him to leave the forest and resume a life amongst people to help build a better world. It's a nice moment because it speaks to the legacy between father and son. It helps Merlin straighten his head and reminds us of the tragedy he's had in his life. It's about overcoming adversity and how your parents can offer a source of strength in a troubling time. It's one scene that manages to show us why Merlin's connection to his father matters so much. But what is his relationship with Ganyetta about? Aside from wanting to hook up and live a domestic cliché, I don't see a whole lot else. And I think you need to show more than that if it's going to motivate your main character to live in the woods for 50 years. The casting of Brett Cooper was another sign that this relationship was supposed to be a big deal. Having actually acted in the past and being a big star for the Daily Wire, they tried to insert her into as many projects as possible while she worked there. You'd really think they would have given her character more to do, though perhaps they were under the impression that Ganyetta was a complex character. For anyone curious about her performance, I don't have a ton to say about it. There's little to work with, and I think her accent speaks for itself.
Will you stand there like a stone, or help me carry back my kill? You will not say, Father. He is as secretive as the Banshee. Will your great light save you if you have the power to save yourself, my love?
According to the production diaries, she's trying to do a Northern English accent that she worked on with a vocal coach, but I'll leave it to the people from that region to tell us how well she pulled it off, when she remembered to use it. To be fair, that last clip I played you isn't actually Ganyetta, rather it's Morgan taking her shape to torment Merlin. So maybe it's very subtle filmmaking to show us that Morgan is the one who can't do the accent. To say something on Morgan, for a character who is so incredibly recognizable, we don't see her very frequently. And when we do, it shifts between this dark horror, like her brutally killing a foal, to something that seems more like it's out of a Saturday morning cartoon, such as her watching Merlin through a magic crystal. Her role as the antagonist is never explained beyond her being jealous of her sister, which also drives her to make a deal with the devil. It's in part motivated by a one-sided crush she had on Taliesin, which happens after they talk to each other in a single scene. People just seem to fall head over heels after the briefest of encounters on this show. It often feels like it doesn't quite understand how relationships work, or simply has no interest in presenting a relationship that is anyway recognizable to a person who lives in the year 2026. As Morgan, Emery Franklin really chews up the scenery every time she shows up.
Emily, a moment ago you were bemoaning the fact that we were all but forgotten by them. But what do I know of these things? I'm merely a wife. And a mother.
I honestly don't know how to feel about this. In another show, I would think she should rein that performance in because it's a little much. But for this show, she might as well have some fun with the role. At least someone is having fun. Within the plot, Morgan is working with the Saxons to try and dash Merlin's dream to help unify Britain. As you might expect, it doesn't work out. The final episode is dedicated to that attempted Saxon invasion and features a long battle between the Saxons and the assembled armies under Aurelius. The battle has a few twists and turns, though the pivotal moment sees Morgan's son, who's been in a handful of scenes up to this point, decide to betray his mother and the Saxons and side with Aurelius and Merlin. It's a pivotal shift that wasn't very well established, and I'm not sure why I cared enough to really be bothered by that. It's almost as if they could have dropped 20 or 30 other characters and instead given Morgan's son far more screen time to flesh out this internal conflict he was apparently carrying. If you're wondering what Merlin was doing in this battle, he was mostly praying, while resisting Morgan's urging that he join the battle.
Great light, preserve our king. Great light. We are lost unless we find ourselves in you.
Merlin's struggle to come to terms with his powers and how to use them is presented in this final episode as him submitting to a higher power, which is a little strange as Merlin never really seemed to have any crisis of faith in this series. Rather, he seemed unsure of when to use his power because he feared the consequences. If the answer is to simply not use his powers at all, he broke that rule plenty of times throughout the series, helping Aurelius and Uther get to this point. If the answer is to know when to use his powers, the divine instructions he's apparently getting aren't terribly well explained. The reason Merlin gives us in the show is because he doesn't want people to start following him instead of Aurelius.
If I lead you into victory, Uther, the men of Britain will proclaim me king.
But that doesn't have any connection to the theological question. It's a practical concern, not a spiritual one. The production diary for the show makes this point instead.
And it's by these two sort of supernatural characters, Taliesin and Merlin, learning not to use their power as an expression of their own will, but to be used by the Most High God.
Merlin not wanting to be king is meant to support the divine right that Aurelius has because of his Roman ancestry, except Aurelius isn't a Christian when Merlin joins his cause. We hear Aurelius is converted to Christianity, but we don't see his conversion. We just see him pester his brother to convert with him.
I've seen what the Fish King and his people have done for the weak and the suffering. I've seen their mercy, and it is stronger than the strength of armies. It is the future of Britain, and it must be our future too. I brought Brother Aaron from Minas Tirith. He's come to instruct you in the Catechism of the Church and baptize you in the name of Lord Yesu.
The conversion of Caris and the rest of the Atlanteans are also abrupt. In this series, Christianity isn't really argued for in a meaningful way. It's presented as a series of high-minded ideals, but characters who convert never seem to do so in a way outside of a hollow submission, as if they've simply been presented with some interesting facts, and whatever spiritual commitments they had before are discarded so easily they never get mentioned again. In that sense, Merlin's arc is more coherent. He can't be king because he has no claim, and a claim is a product of birthright, i.e. part of the natural order, which is controlled by God. So him not using his powers is obeying the will of God, because he's trying to respect that birthright. All of this is done not because he's convinced of anything or feels some kind of spiritual fulfillment, it's just a fact of life. This really captures the series' vision of Christianity as something that is not only factually correct, but so self-evident that its presence is instantly compelling, at least to the heroes of the story. Those who deny it are often presented as closed-minded at best, or outright hostile at worst. I think that's what makes this show particularly insidious. It presents a period in time where the religious character of Britain was changing, and instead of dealing with those conflicts in some kind of internal struggle, Christianity is simply taken as a given, asserting its supremacy by virtue of it simply being true. And it's true because the show says it's true. It's a circular reasoning that is completely unconvincing and makes for a pretty drab story. This would have been a very different show if it had shown characters struggling with questions of faith, maybe comparing their old beliefs to this new one and examining how these new ideas impact their lives or the people around them, how it might offer some kind of comfort or teachings of forgiveness or all the positive aspects of Christianity that might convince someone that it's a good faith to practice. But instead of seeing any of these struggles or conflicts, the show sticks to big battle sequences and sword fights that were far more drab than the spiritual matters the series claims to hold in high regard. Although I don't think the creators have the skill or talent to really present these high-minded moral dilemmas, skipping over them entirely shows that perhaps this just wasn't the right team for this story. Even though I don't identify as a Christian myself, I'm not against seeing a pro-Christian movie if it's presented in a way that's compelling or interesting or well-crafted in some fashion. Though this show is certainly not up to that task and completely fumbles its much simpler and less interesting mission. While promoting this series, Jeremy Boring spoke quite extensively about the religious aspect of it. Here's a clip of him in an interview that he shared in a tweet.
As we tell those stories less and less, the great stories of the Bible, which are true to the mythological stories like King Arthur, we tell them less and less, and when we do tell them, we tell them in more and more deconstructionist forms or secularized forms. What we're really doing is further and further cutting ourselves off from that all-important story of who we are as a people and why we exist.
The endurance of the Arthurian mythology is dependent on a lot of things, but what Boring is rejecting here is its flexibility, that these stories might speak to something more than what he believes are its primal characteristics. What he gets so wrong here is that the Arthurian legend is incredibly messy and has been messed with for centuries. Whilst researching this, I was overwhelmed with the many, many changes to Arthurian legends. Characters like Morgan Le Fay, for example, were originally good rather than evil, or that Merlin's father was originally a demon. There are plenty more examples, and I simply do not have time for them in this video. The Pendragon Cycle is another interpretation and another transformation, one that de-emphasizes the older mythology and instead emphasizes Christianity as the supreme faith. To present this as if it's returning to some purer version of the text is simply untrue. It's just another interpretation in a long line of interpretations. If Boring wanted to adapt one of those older versions of the stories, he could have chosen to adapt a manuscript from the 11th century, but he chose to do a version from the 1980s because it was the version that spoke to him, one written by an American author from that decade who, with no offense to Mr. Lawhead, wasn't tapping into some primal version of the story, but instead telling one according to the sensibilities of a writer living in 1980s America. It's fine to like a certain interpretation of a story, but by pretending it's somehow greater than that seems silly. Although the agenda it's tied to is a little bit more worrying than that. By calling it a foundation story of the West, giving it this grandiose place, he's effectively presenting his series as a valorization of Christianity within modern society. And to do that, he has to project the mindset of Christians like him in the present day back down towards people of centuries past. Because while they both may call themselves Christians, anyone who's a student of history can tell you that there are a multitude of different types of Christians out there, whether it be the 11th century or the present day, or variations within both time periods. Also, for all the Daily Wire's complaining about Hollywood forcing an agenda on people, the sort of thing they supposedly set out to reject with their entertainment projects, the Pendragon Cycle is pushing a pro-Christian agenda, much like Lady Ballers was pushing an anti-trans agenda, is a clear example of them perfectly happy with pushing an agenda, just so long as it's their own. To be clear though, I actually don't think having an agenda or a point of view of some kind is an inherently bad thing for a work of art. Depending on what that agenda is, it can obviously make it more difficult to enjoy a work of art. But many great works of art throughout history have been created in order to push a variety of different agendas. Many Arthurian legends in the past had similar goals in mind. The reason the Pendragon Cycle doesn't work is because it's not very well made. Here's another quick example from the final episode. Since Karis doesn't have anything to do in the final battle, we get this moment instead where she's treating the wounded alongside Yagurna, who's there to set up a love triangle between Aurelius and Uther, but that never actually gets explored in this season. But she does get to do this.
Yagurna!
We don't get much more of this scene aside from the war movie cliche of the horrors that war entails. This moment is actually at odds with the rest of the episode and the series, which shows that there's a lot of glory to be found in battle, and that the Saxons are brutal barbarians that need to be violently repelled. In fact, fighting is usually the answer to most problems in this series, and this anti-war scene feels very out of place. This moment does answer the question of what these women are doing during the battle. That takes up most of this episode. And it turns out what they're doing is a boring cliche. Honestly, it would have been better to just not include them at all, but the series is filled with decisions like this. Going tonally in the opposite direction, 10 minutes later in this same episode, we see Genyetta's father, who only has one arm, beat a man to death with his prosthetic. I'm not entirely sure this was supposed to make me laugh, but I thought it was hilarious. This looks absolutely ridiculous to do in the middle of a battle. I'm not sure why it's here aside from giving Genyetta's father something to do in this giant melee, and it's one of the things that annoyed me in the final episode. It often felt like it was a long name check for the characters who have appeared throughout the season, giving them stuff to do, but nothing that's actually interesting or has anything to do with their arcs as characters. They're just there to make up the numbers in the final episode. It really speaks to why this series just doesn't work, and reminds us that a lot of characters have been introduced in this series and are basically now reduced to standing around in cliches or, I guess, beating people to death with their prosthetics. There is a space for exploring Arthurian myth and what it says about the modern day and how religion is experienced. But this series, instead of trying to challenge itself, is too conservative in the creative sense, clinging to cliches and running through plot points rather than having anything interesting to say. Even if it's going to stick to cliches, it doesn't do them well enough to be engaging. To truly push back against the secularism toppling statues as boring claims to be doing, it needed to address that head on. Instead, it chose to avoid that topic by asserting its Christian identity as supreme while presenting a drab sword and sorcery story. To be fair to the people working on the show, I think some talent behind elements of the production is certainly there. Those bull jumpers, for instance, show tremendous athletic skill. Although I'm not entirely sure these bulls are being well treated, as these bull jumpers were recruited from Spain, and even though I'm Spanish myself, I'm not terribly fond of the practice of bullfighting. We could see other examples of talent on display, such as beautiful shots of scenery. The cinematographer is at least doing something right. But ultimately, it doesn't matter how many talented people were hired for this production if the people at the top don't know how to use them properly. The Pendragon Cycle's 8-figure budget can't replace a lack of creative experience. To quickly wrap up what happens in this series before moving on, the opening shot in the first episode shows us the sword and the stone, a classic image in Arthurian legend, but that actually doesn't happen in the main narrative of the season. Rather, the final episode closes with Merlin having a vision, where he is the one driving the sword into the stone because the kingdom he just helped shape is falling apart. So the primary image for the series is actually a tease for another season that may or may not be happening. The reception to the Pendragon Cycle has been somewhat positive from the reviews of it I could find, although they exclusively come from a small batch of regular Daily Wire subscribers. The general consensus seems to be that the first 2 episodes are the weakest of the bunch, and it improves over the next 5, which I agree with, though for me it never quite reached the level of it being a good show, just one that learned how to be slightly less boring. Or perhaps a lot less boring, since Jeremy Boring wasn't writing or directing the later episodes, aside from co-writing the last one. Without any real metrics, it's hard to gauge just how many people watch this thing. The Daily Wire did spend some money promoting it, in part, it seems, through buying ads on social media. In my video on Ben Shapiro, I speculated about whether the Daily Wire was buying views for his videos, based on their suspiciously low engagement. Since then, I've heard from people that the Daily Wire is buying ads on YouTube where they are running their full-length videos, inflating their view counts by serving them up as ads rather than people organically clicking on them. Whatever the mechanism they're using, I think it's happening to an even larger scale for the videos promoting the Pendragon Cycle. For example, a trailer for the Pendragon Cycle has 3.4 million views, but only a little less than 600 comments. Comparatively, a trailer for the Wonder Man series with 5.4 million views has nearly 8,000 comments. One trailer for A Night of the Seven Kingdoms has 6.9 million views with over 10,000 comments. And another trailer for the Pendragon Cycle from a few months back has 6.1 million views and somehow has even less comments than the newer trailer, with slightly more than 200. The view numbers here are clearly being cooked. Ahead of the Pendragon Cycle's release, Jeremy Boring had an interview with Deadline where he revealed why it had taken the show so long to finally be released. He explained how, with the Pendragon Cycle, they were breaking from their usual strategy of putting it on their own service and instead trying to sell it to another platform. He said, "It wasn't part of our model to solicit distribution. The Pendragon Cycle was the first time we considered it. It was a completely different scale to things we had done before, so we wanted maximum eyeballs on it. In the end, we weren't able to make a deal on the show, but having read a lot of the feedback from various streamers, there were a lot of compliments for what we accomplished." This is a pretty big admission. With a few exceptions, the entertainment end of the Daily Wire has not been the roaring success Boring had speculated it would be. The plan had been to use exclusives to help drive subscriptions to the Daily Wire Plus, but by switching over to licensing their exclusive titles to competitors, it goes against the usual strategy of holding on to exclusives. Netflix, for example, doesn't license Stranger Things because Stranger Things attracts new subscribers. The Pendragon Cycle is also not the only title they broke exclusivity for. Lady Ballers was originally an exclusive for the Daily Wire Plus, but later had its non-exclusive streaming rights sold to Amazon Prime. They've also been doing something similar with their children's media exclusives. Full episodes of Chip-Chilla, for instance, have been uploaded to YouTube. If this new strategy is meant to get the Daily Wire's programming in front of more eyeballs, I'm not sure it's working particularly well, at least based on the numbers for Chip-Chilla, a channel whose total views across all its videos are a fraction the number of a recent video by my friend Lola Sebastian, where she covered the show. Speaking to the Daily Wire's entertainment ambitions, we got a few more bits of info from that Deadline article, specifically Jeremy Boring defending the company's decision to pursue entertainment. When asked if that particular strategy was lucrative, Boring said, "It was enormously lucrative during my tenure. The overwhelming majority of our subscription revenue was tied to entertainment content, and subscription revenue was the overwhelming majority of our revenue." Boring is very good at presenting the image of success without actually describing it. What does tied to entertainment content mean in this context? And if it drives subscriber revenue, how does that square with not holding on to exclusives? The few times we got revenue numbers from Boring during his tenure, it was often quoted as $150 million to $200 million a year. Although originally he would put it closer to $100 million, the only real project that seemed to have a massive jump in subscribers was the What is a Woman movie from Matt Walsh. One estimate from one of its producers put it at earning roughly $30 million for the company. I've not heard of any of their other entertainment projects being nearly as successful. And that's not even touching the bigger failure of Benki. Boring was asked about Benki and its future in the interview. He said, "We launched multiple shows that spanned multiple seasons, shows that I'm very proud of. We wrote a lot of checks, built a large team, and launched various properties that were very well received by our audience. I don't have visibility on future plans in that space because I haven't been CEO for almost a year now. It's hard to believe they'll be launching any more original productions since they laid off the entire originals department. The service is still up and running, though when I check to see if any new ratings have been added, there doesn't seem to have been any significant changes in the last 10 months. Not a great sign. Noting that this programming was apparently well received by their audience only seems to highlight that audience simply isn't large enough to sustain continued production on these originals in the future. As for that Brett Cooper Snow White movie, we got an update on that from Boring as well. He said, "You'd have to ask Brett why she quit. You help create or grow talent, and then they can just take the value and leave. That's a challenge for the entire industry as we go forward, both in Hollywood and much more in news, politics, and podcasting." He's definitely not bitter, though. As for the future of Daily Wire's entertainment ambitions, apparently moving forward without Jeremy Boring, there was the recent news that they're working on a new movie starring Jonathan Majors.
They're very upset about this. There's lots of tweets. Okay, here's the deal, you whiny little bitches. We don't care, because Jonathan Majors was canceled all the way back in 2023. We're ecstatic to bring him back. He's unbelievably talented. And if you're upset now, wait until you see this film. Your heads are going to explode.
Jonathan Majors was canceled because he was found guilty on 2 charges of domestic violence towards his former girlfriend. This isn't exactly breaking a trend for the Daily Wire chasing after people kicked out of Hollywood, but this, I believe, is the first time they've hired an actor convicted of domestic violence. Although Dallas Sonye, the movie producer the Daily Wire regularly collaborates with, does have a history of protecting sexual predators. This new Jonathan Majors movie is written and directed by Kyle Rankin, who previously took on both roles for the movie Run, Hide, Fight, the school shooting action movie the Daily Wire bought the rights to when it first entered the entertainment space. From what little we know about the plot so far, it's about a group of Americans that must defend their homeland from a foreign menace. The producers credit Red Dawn and Toy Soldiers as inspiration. Honestly, I'm slightly surprised that they're trying to make another movie. The company seemed badly burned after its various entertainment venture failures, but after getting a huge infusion of new funds, to the tune of an additional $100 million this past September, it looks like one of their first big moves is to take another crack at making movies. One funny note about this update is it highlights the valuation of the company, and it puts that number at $850 million, including that $100 million investment. Over a year ago, back when Jeremy Boring was co-CEO of the company, he mused on the idea of whether or not Fox News might be interested in buying the Daily Wire, and he said the company was worth more than $1 billion. Clearly, in between the time he said that and when they got this new round of funding, the company's value dropped by $250 million. Although it is possible that Boring could have been lying when he gave that $1 billion-plus figure. Whatever the reason, it shows us how these conservative media companies have access to venture capital funding that keeps them afloat, even after a series of failure that seems to cost them a quarter of the value of their company. It's why I named my video The Daily Wire's Decline and not The Daily Wire's End. When it comes to investment for conservative media companies, there always seems to be a bottomless well of cash. Going back to the Pendragon Cycle, how does that figure into the future of the Daily Wire and its entertainment ambitions? Obviously, the attempt to sell it to another streamer failed, so it instead sits in relative anonymity on the Daily Wire Plus. Speaking to Mediaite, executive producer Dallas Sonye said, "From a financial perspective, I think it's going to be more of an investment in the future, right? I mean, this is a huge investment to recoup. I don't know how the math works, but that seems like a long road. But if they invest in that level of production, if you build it, they will come kind of mentality. All of a sudden now, other creators are going to see, oh my God, they're spending real money on their projects. And so the Pendragon Cycle has opened a bunch of doors for creators, filmmakers, writers, directors to be calling us saying, hey, we want to be in business with Daily Wire if they're doing that. If one of the people behind those doors was Jonathan Majors, I'd say you're better off slamming that one shut. But apparently, he's the guy they're going with. Also, I can't not share this other quote from Sonye in the interview where he talks about the kinship he has with the Daily Wire people. We all share this common belief that movies ended in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected. He killed comedy, he killed rock and roll, he killed fun and joy. And so for me, it's like, I think we all agree that the answer to making movies great again is to make them like we used to make them before 2008. The quote really speaks to the delusional nature of some of the people working on this project. And I have to throw back to my favorite clip about Obama killing entertainment from Brandon Sutton on The Majority Report.
Before Obama, we had like Fist of the North Star and Dragon Ball Z and, all of these like shonen boys anime. And then after, everyone is like going into video games and trying to bang their sister. And that's just like, what Obama did to the genre.
Here's Jeremy Boring when he asked if he thought the Pendragon Cycle would be received as a Christian Game of Thrones. I'm hoping it'll be a mainstream Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones was subversive when it was released, particularly because of its innate nihilism. I believe that Pendragon is subversive in the moment of its release, particularly because of its rejection of nihilism. It's a really baffling read of Game of Thrones. The gritty nature of the show is not the same as being nihilistic. It doesn't present its traditions as meaningless, but explores the nature of how they're used to control people, how the lust for power from a few creates endless cycles of suffering experienced by others. One very unfortunate twist for the Pendragon Cycle is that it came out at the same time as A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. I don't know if this was strategic, possibly hoping for another fumble like the final season of Game of Thrones, or maybe they were hoping to catch people wanting to watch more fantasy after they finished the HBO series. The problem is that the similar release dates and genres invites a comparison between the two. And in my mind, and I suspect most of the viewing audience being the small group of people who have watched both, the Pendragon Cycle doesn't come anywhere close to the quality of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, not just when speaking about its budget, but the quality of its writing, acting, story, direction, and just about anything you could list that makes up a production. It's a show that takes less than half as much time to tell a story that's several times more enjoyable. If you were wondering whether or not you should watch the Pendragon Cycle, I would recommend you watch A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. And if you've already seen A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, just watch it again and you'll have a better time. There is also the looming question of whether or not the Pendragon Cycle will get a second season. Speaking to Mediaite, Boring told us that a draft for the second season has already been written. However, in the Deadline interview, he said, "When I started this project, I had a lot of influence over whether or not there would be a second season. And now I'm like every filmmaker, just hoping that our show is successful and hoping that it creates the financial incentives for Daily Wire to want to take a second bite at the apple. I believe people there would like to see the story continue. It's their show now, so they'll decide." With that new funding of $100 million, I suppose it's possible they're ready to blow another 8-figure budget on Jeremy Boring's pet project, but I am skeptical. Far more captivating than a bad adaptation's drab final battle was Tara Mooney's The Breastfeeding Wars, offering a history lesson on the long-standing culture war issue and why that debate refuses to die. This video is part of her new series, Politics, which looks at culture wars and how they intersect with breasts, a part of the body I've heard a lot of good things about. I've only watched the first 3 episodes so far, but they've all been great and they're streaming exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is a creator-owned streaming service I recently joined that includes a lot of other creators that I have a ton of respect for, including Sarah Zed, Tom Nicholas, and Maggie Mae Fish. Nebula's lineup includes over 200 creators releasing some cool exclusives you'll only find there, all of it ad-free and helping to support creators like me bring you more great videos. If you're curious, use my link below, go.nebula.tv/Jose to sign up. With my link, you get 50% off of Nebula, which is just $30 a year or $250 a month. You can also use my link to get $200 off a Nebula lifetime plan. That's just $300 for lifetime access to Nebula. One thing that's hard to capture is the way my heart sank every time I would start a new episode of the Pendragon Cycle and see just how long the runtime was for it. I think the shortest episode was 59 minutes, and others typically stretched beyond an hour to an hour and 5 or an hour and 10 minutes. And having to sit through the whole thing felt like a chore at times because it's just not a compelling show. If you're considering watching it for fun or to mock or laugh at, I would say it's not worth that either. This video tells you everything you need to know about it. Instead, you should do anything better with your time than watch this thing. Perhaps you should just watch another one of my videos. Maybe you'll like it enough to become a patron, like the fine folks you see scrolling up the screen right now. Their support helps make videos like this happen, and I am very grateful for it. Becoming a patron or member of the channel gives you early access to videos, your name in the credits, and some fun little extras I throw in every now and again. You can also support the channel by joining Nebula through my promo code linked below. Or if you'd like to support this channel in a non-monetary fashion, you can like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, or share this post on social media. If you want to leave a comment but aren't sure what to say, why not share your favorite adaptation of Arthurian legend? Or maybe your favorite story or character, or I don't know, something related to King Arthur. You can decide. Thank you all so much for watching.